So we're seeing logistics constraints along with crane constraints and other issues becoming some of the biggest bottlenecks for a record year next year. So it's a significant driver shortage and a significant trailer shortage is expected for 2020 and may delay the COD or the commercial operation date for a lot of projects into 2021. So every time we update our forecast, we do this every quarter, we're showing more and more activity moving from 2020 to 2021 just because of some of these constraints that just continue to pile up. So, what the chart on the left illustrates is that trailer demand for greater than 55-meter blades is far in excess of the available number of trailers and the available number of drivers. So there's a significant shortage that we expect for next year. And some of the technology solutions that have been developed to serve this market haven't really been deployed in the U.S. yet. One example is modular segmented blades. So there's been a lot of this deployed in Europe, as the chart on the right shows. Over up to kind of 1.5 gigawatts has been deployed in Europe annually, but we're not expecting any of those modular blades to really hit the U.S. market until after the production tax credit cliff. So that was just a kind of high-level overview of the market. We're going to launch now into more of an open panel discussion. So we'd welcome any questions from the audience as well. And we'll hear from a very, very experienced and knowledgeable panel here to walk us through the rest of the presentation, or the rest of the panel. All right, the first question we have is actually for Thomas from Vestas. So 2020, as we discussed, is expected to be a record year for the wind energy industry in the U.S. So are you seeing some of these logistics barriers either delaying a lot of projects, or are there any projects that you see will actually be canceled because of some of these logistics constraints?
We don't see any cancellations. We definitely see the restraints in the market and the concepts of how we're moving components. And we have a larger blade coming to the U.S. market. We have a V150, which is being moved by some of these guys. And we're also looking into a more diverse market. Now we have a 5.6 turbine, megawatt turbine coming into the market, where we see a 83.5 meter blade, which is a lot more than you see today on the V162 turbine. And that will definitely need to be rethinked of how you move this around. I think we hopefully get the rail clearance on this, but on the roads, it will create some challenges. So we definitely see that, yes. But delaying projects, hopefully not.
Anyone else from the audience seeing significant delays or projects moving out to 2021?
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit on that. We have seen developers that are coming into OEMs a little bit later in the 2019 asking for projects, and those become a little more sensitive for us because of the market constraints on equipment availability and the speed demand for turbines. We are looking into supporting everybody, but discussions have become a lot tighter with carriers, railroads, and it's all due to equipment availability, driver availability to support all the projects.
So another one for you, Felipe. We've seen historically, we've seen a lot of shipments kind of pile up in the second and third quarters of these PTC expiration years. So, the rules are that you have to have your project online by December 31st. So usually the erection and commissioning happens in the fourth quarter, which means a lot of transportation happens in the second and third quarter. So are you seeing any changes now as we kind of see this PTC cliff that's coming, but it's been coming for a long time. So it's been given some developers a chance to plan ahead. Are you seeing any of that?
Yeah, we still see a peak, Q2, Q3 for transportation. However, developers have been a lot more proactive in trying to levelize the year. We have more projects in Q1 and Q2 delivering than we have before. And that's mainly driven by the developers acknowledging that there is a peak in demand. There's a a shortage in the number of assets that can be deployed in the market to support transportation.
Any other thoughts on the timing of shipments?
Yeah, definitely. We see for the last Q of this year has been as busy as, or we are delivering as much turbines as we deliver last year. So the next Q in 2020, the first Q will be as busy as 2019 in all. So that kind of it shows you a picture. What you also showed on the numbers of turbine that is going to be moved into the market is huge. It's like pearls on a string, and there's really little room for stops and goes and missing equipment. And I think we share the same challenges in all the OEMs. And so the availability of rail cars or trucks and permits is crucial for moving our business.
And with that, I'll pose a question to Greg on railcar availability. So, there's a lot of issues here. You have an older fleet of rail cars. Some of them are aging out. You have, limited supply of rail cars. You have demand from other markets like the pipe market, and lots of other markets are leaning on rail right now. So, what do you see are some of the near-term solutions for this to solve the 2020 peak?
Yeah, so on the rail car piece, we have had attrition. A lot of the cars that started out in the wind fleet when wind blades were babies have kind of already aged out. So, we have gone through an extensive reconditioning or actually purchasing program. So we have not only replaced those cars that have attrited, we've also then expanded the fleet to meet opportunities based on working with our commercial partners. Some other things we're doing is trying to allocate cars that may or not have been in a wind fleet before. So we're talking maybe using pipe flats and stripping off fixtures if they're not being used for that service. The longer blades necessitate having idler cars to span between the loads. So we're pushing machinery flats, military flats that have been used for that service, or actually for service of dimensional project cargo for holding as buffers for the weight. We're using those flat cars now in the wind fleets, and then using more conventional cars like box cars, covered hoppers, for project cargo purposes of spacing out really heavy loads, or in the case of like a BNSF served destination, we're actually using company material cars to help fill that need and kind of push any extra capacity we can to the opportunity for the wind fleet. So trying to think outside the box on what we've not done before to increase that availability.
And David, same question on the trailer fleet. So are you already seeing a significant shortage pile up for specialized blade trailers, tower trailers, or other equipment?
Yes, I think the slide that was shown a minute ago about the demand versus the equipment availability and the driver availability was right on target. And it's going to be a difficult year to supply everything, but we tend to look at it more as a team approach when we have a situation like this. Wind traditionally has had its peaks and valleys. But what I mean by a team approach is understanding what our capacity is, dealing with our customers and what their requirements are, working with them on what their sourcing can be, and also bringing into the picture the state officials, the permit officials. But working as a team and all working together and planning what we can do tend to be a lot more successful, and you can deliver a lot more product sometimes with a little less equipment when you take the team approach like that. But the trailer fleet, the new demand for trailers and a longer blade, you can get the trailers, but can you get the drivers that have the skill to move them? That's the big problem right now.
And you mentioned state permitting and other things. I mean, there's a few states that are difficult to move through in the country. So, Steve, can you talk a little bit about these barrier states or these issues that from permitting or other reasons why it's hard to move equipment through states?
I'd be happy to, Aaron. I'm not going to win any popularity contests in this crowd or on this panel, but from a carrier standpoint, which is who our trade association primarily represents, most in this room would agree there's going to be a lot of money to be made over the next year and a half with proper planning and smarts. But there's two things that can derail that from a carrier standpoint, in our opinion, and that is ignorance and greed. And to Aaron's question, I'll cover the ignorance part. The American Transportation Research Institute, ATRI, anybody familiar with that consultant group? very highly respected. In fact, many of their consultants are former state DOT officials. They recently concluded an independent study, and in their study, they concluded, if you don't mind me reading one sentence here, and that is, as many states will attest, they interviewed state officials themselves, the basis for some state regulations governing permits are extremely dated and not based on any empirical data or evidence. I run into this every day. Progress has been made, as David will attest. His home state of Texas is one of the better ones, but there are still approximately 15 states across the country that are literally still stuck in Flintstone days, prehistoric days, 1970s, 1980s technology. They're weight engineers relying on studies from the 1950s and 1960s, not taking into account in any way, shape, or form the extreme progress that has been made in manufacturing, not only of equipment like Vestas and Siemens, but on our side, trailers and such. And so as we move through these barrier states, as I call them, as Lone Star does on a daily basis and many others, this study concluded that it costs a carrier an additional 40 to 80% in additional unnecessary cost, either running through a barrier state or around a barrier state. We have an initiative within our association. I have handouts if you'd like, or I can email them to you. And any of you that have influence within any of these state governments, as David will attest, it is imperative that it's the old weakest link of the chain deal. Lone Star can run through 5 states with their loads. And in 4 of those states, if it goes like this, that's fine. But if one state holds them up, it holds the whole process up. So yes, we do still have a problem with barrier states. And quite ironically, Aaron, to conclude, it's actually as a result of the 35 other states getting with it in terms of technology and expediency, it's cast a bullseye even more so on those backward states, as I call them, those barrier states. Back in the day, 15, 20 years ago, just about every state took a week, 2, 3 weeks to get your permits. Now that we have 30, 35 states that can whip out permits in 5 minutes or less, those 15 states that are still taking days and weeks, they really, really put a chink in the armor.
So, given that background, equipment availability issues, the long distances that we have to travel between ports and wind sites, the U.S. is a big place and have to go through some of these barrier states sometimes. So, Felipe, can you talk about any time where, you've had to move around a state, or maybe you've changed modes of transportation just because of some of these issues, either equipment constraints, barrier state issues, or other reasons why you trade off between modes of transportation?
We recently had a project in Illinois in which we had some large nacelles going in there, and the original strategy was to rail and then truck about 75 miles to the project site, but we could not find a suitable rail location that we could clear into. And the only one we found, we couldn't get out of by truck because of bridge height. So it was the perfect storm in a way. We were then had to shift to a barging strategy, and we took them up the river, and we're able to still get within the 75 miles, but then obviously it's a completely different logistics when you're barging than when you're railing. And it was, for us, a lessons learned on how quickly things can change and how you have to be able to adapt very quickly.
And Thomas, Vestas has invested heavily in rail transportation at your factories as well as at other infrastructure sites across the U.S. I mean, what's driven a lot of that decision? And have you, like Felipe said, have you had to stay flexible from time to time?
Definitely. So one of the main reasons that I'm here today, also with 2 of my really bright guys and colleagues, is that innovation is moving this, and you need to be more closer to your suppliers. They're all here, and our OEM colleagues. So one of the initiatives that Siemens Gamesa and Vestas LM, which is owned by GE, we sat down and it's called Wind Industrialization. And this forum is established to create a standard across the industry on transportation equipment. you know, we don't gain more volume in any market by having a smarter transport frame. That's fact. It creates a lot of issues for Lone Star, for the rail companies, for the SCNR members, when they need to handle different components, different systems, technical complex systems, clamps with hydraulics that they're not educated in. We miss training, which I hear from your members. We had a meeting yesterday where this was really highlighted. Safety, big issue. It's big components. If you have an 83 meter or even a 73.5 meter blade that looks like a banana, you cannot review from the end to the other. And you need to be at a technical point where it's really difficult to get people. So standardizing this equipment, it makes it easier for the suppliers here in the market to move them. It's not only in the US. So we are working, and the first one is actually blades with LM. We're starting this up now. And the good thing about this is everything is open-minded, meaning it's an open book. So there's no patents. And we need to invite broadly, meaning that when we do this forum, we need to have all the OEMs invited. We need to have even Senvion, Siemens Gamesa, every OEM that makes wind turbines, the trucking companies across the world, they will be invited. So I think that is the way to move. And this is where we need to move the innovation together on the standardization part. It's high on the agenda investors. And we only see this as an opportunity also to get closer to the suppliers and get things moving in a more smooth and standardized way. And said that is, of course, money, right? So who's going to pay for it? Are we going to put that on Lone Star? Probably not. We are trying to do it, but it won't work, right? And Siemens Gamesa will try the same. It won't probably work. And my colleague Greg, he won't take it either. So we probably need to figure out a smart solution on this. There are funds, at least in Europe. They have millions and billions of euros to invest in this innovation. So what we're trying to do is to create a fund, paid for the consultants. They also want money. And basically paid for their time, the test and equipment, and then basically it's open up in the market. We have found leasing companies who have a lot of investment money in SCNR regime, and they'll be able to invest in this equipment and basically lease it out. It basically comes down to a business case and volume. So both Siemens and Vestas and GE, which are one of the big players, we need to commit to volume to get this moving, right? And be a bit more open on the volumes we have the next 3 years.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, as you mentioned, a lot of these suppliers, particularly blade suppliers, serve multiple clients. So it makes it a lot easier for them if they can just use one type of rigging equipment, one type of transport frame, et cetera. And it becomes even more important as we transition to the next generation of turbines, that 70-meter blades, 80-meter blades for the onshore market. We're getting there soon. We're expecting to see a lot more of the larger 4 and 5 megawatt blades turbines come into the U.S., particularly after the production tax credit expires. So, shifting gears a little bit to how turbine size impacts logistics. So, question for Greg at BNSF. How have you seen from the rail side? How have you seen the increase in turbine size, the increase in blade size, tower weight and dimensions? How have you seen them, complicate or exacerbate some of the logistics bottlenecks?
Okay, so I'll take this kind of as a North American network for all Class 1s, because I think we're all see the pain and see the size changes. So it's a real reality now. But we see the tower sizes changing, and it's really being driven off of obviously the growth. But one thing that rails are now come up and we get now is a through truss type bridge. So a bridge that the rail trains go through that has a full superstructure. Most of those bridges across the North American network were made at about 14-foot width. And so as we get to towers that are beyond 13 foot, going to 14-foot, 15-foot in diameter, we physically are not able to clear these type of towers through these bridge structures. And that's a pain that's shared by all my Class 1 counterparts and short line regionals in our Railway Industrial Clearance Association. So that is tough, because that takes what we may have 4 or 5 routes to get to a wind distribution site, and because of the component sizes changing, now I'm down to one opportunity, one route that maybe is limited, and then now because of like Felipe mentioned, that route may not have a distribution site availability on it, so now we become where we have to look into a multimodal solution, maybe take it somewhere else and transload to either a barge or a truck to make that delivery because we cannot physically get it from origin to destination on rail because of that size barrier. Same with blade length. We're seeing blades increasing 20 foot a year. So now we're running 240 feet blade length. That does create challenges. And if all the railroads are not all participating in that, that also limits our ability to flex the rail transportation supply chain across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, if not everyone's fully engaged and participating in those new sizes. So I think a big part of that is trying to be proactive, working with the OEMs, the suppliers who build the fixtures, and get ahead of it and kind of explain the barriers so we can mitigate the barriers, and also then demonstrate with other carriers how we can work together to find a working solution.
So kind of related question for David, can the existing infrastructure that's out there for trailers, can it handle these longer blades? We've talked about the capacity issues for trailer availability, driver availability, but are you running into a lot of issues on roads and turns and bridge heights? And are there any near-term changes that you would recommend that are possible over the next year?
Yes, and yes. Okay. I think I want to comment on one thing. We talk about the new blades, the new nacelles, the new equipment. There's a couple of constants that are always there. The first is our infrastructure here in North America. That's not changing. So the bigger the pieces get, it doesn't mean the turns get wider or the bridges get bigger. It's just something we have to deal with. And that's one of the constants. And the second constant is we permit these loads through states. And I think it's always important to remember that a permit is permission. It's just not something you automatically get. You're asking the state for permission. And their first duty is to the motoring public in their state. And we go to them with routes, and they have to approve that. But there's a reason they have to do that. And that's why many times we want to go ahead of time and look at routes with them and discuss with them and have them on the team. I mentioned earlier about getting this accomplished. The infrastructure is not changing in our country. And when you get the longer blades, it takes longer to turn them. It takes longer to get them down the road. It stacks up more traffic. So there's a lot of elements that go into this. Can you create some additional avenues? You can increase turn size in some places. You might get different areas that you can get into from a different entranceway. But it gets more and more difficult to move simply because there's not a way to get it there. Now, I'll go to the other side of the coin and say you can get it there if you've got the money. Okay? We have some video that shows a particular blade making a turn. It almost hits a power pole. It goes over speed limit signs. If you want to spend the money to take those signs out and pull them out and do these things, yeah, you can do those. And it's more expensive the longer the haul is. The longer you go, the more signs you have to move, the more traffic you have to go through. All these things play into it. It's like I said earlier, the sourcing becomes very important as to how much you can move during a peak year like we're going to have right now. But the 2 points to make is that the infrastructure and the state permit people, those are constants. They have a duty to the motoring public, and unless someone's doing something I don't know, the infrastructure is not changing to accommodate the bigger loads. We have to accommodate the bigger loads and try to get them through the infrastructure we already have.
You bring up a really good point about safety, especially interaction with the motorized public, and how you deal with traffic and working around infrastructure. And a lot of that is just having qualified drivers. And I think that's the biggest issue for these longer blades, is finding drivers that know what they're doing. And I think over the next couple years, we may see kind of a squeeze out there between drivers that are capable and then drivers that can do it safely, and that may really affect the industry. So
I'd like to comment on that just a second. Sure. Everybody knows the driver problem. We have, and I just want to ask this for the people in the audience: how many of you are raising sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, grandchildren to be truck drivers? How many are raising to be truck drivers? I ask that question a lot, and I get the same answer. Not many people. So it's not only the driver shortage, but it's a shortage of qualified drivers that can move these long loads. And anymore, a blade load is not just the driver. it's the steerman in the back and the escort. It's a team effort to move a blade around a turn so you don't steer it into something. So it's a real issue out there, and it takes a team to move it. And driver qualification in general in our country is much more difficult now. And get these guys that know how to move something like that, it takes a true professional, and there's just not that many of them out there anymore.
Yeah, and Steve, you represent a lot of these drivers and specialized folks. Do you want to talk a little bit about the squeeze and how you see that might affect the industry?
Sure, Aaron. In my continued quest to win the most unpopular person in the room, I mentioned earlier, I think two things can derail, pardon the pun, can derail this for the carrier industry, and that I mentioned ignorance, and now I'll touch on the very sensitive subject of greed. I'll give you a hypothetical that unfortunately happens, maybe not with any of the OEMs represented in the room, but it unfortunately happens, and that is, as you've heard, we have the delays from last year that are leading into the coming year and such, and pressure begins to mount to the OEMs and the shippers and those folks, and we see these delays. All of a sudden, unfortunately, not just unqualified drivers like David talked about, but I think that an even bigger problem that we're going to see, and I hope I'm wrong, are unqualified carriers. Now, we at SC&A are all about competition, and we don't mind additional carriers jumping in with Lone Star and some of the others and you know, taking baby steps and working their way up. But as these pressures mount, where I fear greed could bring us all down, is this, and that is, and it happens, it's already happening, carriers stepping up, and I use carriers with quotation marks because in some cases they're not carriers with even half the training program that a Lone Star has with their drivers. Carriers stepping up and approaching OEMs and shippers and saying, we can get you that load moved in 2 weeks' time less or several days' time less than every other carrier that these OEMs are used to working with. When you hear that, it's possible that that carrier, maybe through their own unique engineering or technology or trailers, might be able to make that work. But more often than not, you're dealing with a carrier in that respect who is going to violate those safety standards that David mentioned the state looks out after. They're going to roll the dice. It's already happening. They're going to run without permits. They're going to run without escorts. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about greed. We understand time is money for shippers and OEMs. The same is true in our industry. But at the same time, as more and more state officials start clamoring to us about concerns about bridge hits and taking out curb and gutters and small town mayors raising stinks like they are in Kansas right now, if we let greed get the best of us and we fall into that temptation of selecting carriers that can't even hold, pardon my language, carriers like Lone Star's jockstrap out there, if we start yielding to that temptation and that greed, we're going to have troubles, particularly over the next year or two when the volume is just exploding. So we're here to call on the shippers and the OEMs to, yes, watch the bottom line, but at the same time, don't win a battle, that is one set of moves through a particular state, only to lose the war because those states in the future will say, not through my state. And we're already seeing that. Sorry to be so doom and gloomish, but
no, it's going to be a tough haul the next couple of years, right? So I'd like to talk a little bit about technology solutions. You know, looking to the OEMs, what kind of, you know, blades are a big constraint, towers are a big constraint. You know, these modular nacelles, you know, sometimes the impulse is to try to split these things up, but then you add another issue of field assembly on the back end. They may be easier to move, but you add a lot of time and cost and process to assemble them in the field. So, you know, looking to Vestas, what technology do you guys have kind of in the pipeline for making these components either easier to ship, splitting them up into pieces, and how soon do you expect to deploy that to the U.S.?
It's already deployed. So a lot of the V136, V150, V162, this transport system has been deployed as covering all these turbine types. So we try to make it as generic and standard as possible, meaning you can scale it up. And that goes on to the construction side, where we have some lifting yokes that basically can cover all these variants. So in the future, Vestas has an Inventus platform, which is coming up. That's where we say the really long blades. Sorry for that. They're coming up, and basically what you will see that there will be a lot of variances coming out. We will have between, again, 50 or 60 different designs coming out every year on different variances, different nacelles, different blade types, different hubs, etc. So back to the design, I think what's killing us at the moment is, of course, there is a limit, right? So we talked to these guys and said, where are the restraints? Where's the sweet spot? When do we need to cut the blade? We can do that. But when does it make sense? I need to go back to my 3,500 engineer colleagues and explain them why we need to split. And I need to have a goddamn good reason to do that. And there needs to be a good business case, but also restraints. And we are getting there. So I think at least we have blood in our mouth in physical restraints in the market where we can move stuff. So we work really closely with these guys to figure out where's the sweet spot. So and when we have that, we will split the blade. We have to. So we need to split these components. We cannot move a 100-meter blade. I think that's simply not feasible. As you said, the infrastructure, that goes also for the rail guys. There are simply restraints, bridges, stuff we can't move. So,
but you know, that being said, if you look backwards in the history of the industry, 10 years ago, you know, the 49 meter was the max, right? And then the industry found a way to innovate beyond that with railcar solutions, with extendable beam trailers, and all kinds of solutions. So they just keep kind of pushing the goalposts out. But you know, I think Vestas and Siemens Gamesa have a demonstrated track record with the large diameter steel tower that's segmented. With, you know, Gamesa on the G10X had the segmented blade. Do you see a promise for that technology in the U.S.?
As Thomas said, we are all looking at alternatives, and split blade is certainly one that we are looking into and working on potential solutions, business case. Again, the communication with engineering teams to support and provide data that confirms to them that it makes sense to do it. One thing that, you know, related to the 40-some meter blade that we thought was the end of it, and we couldn't get any larger, and then we did it, and then we did it again. I think we are now getting into, you know, back on the 40-some meter blades, you didn't have as many issues finding a suitable route. You didn't even have as many road modifications needed to get to a project site. You didn't have as many rail clearances turned down. You had some indicators that, even though no one wanted to deal with the longer blade at the time, you had indicators that, okay, we can figure it out. Now we're seeing a point where you lose a route mid-project because of construction or whatever reason. You may not find another route because you're simply too large. You may not get the permissions to get through permitting, or a private landowner may simply not want you to improve 20,000 square feet in his property. Same goes on rail. You know, you get to a point that you're constraining the blade and hoping that you can tie it up enough so it doesn't swing out and allow you to clear, but it's very difficult. We're truly getting into the end of the road here when it comes to sizes. And it's important to go modular. It's important to look at options, because developers do want larger rotor sizes. If you look at the last 2 years, we grew so fast from the mid to high 50s into the high 60s and 70s, when before, to go from mid 50s to high 50s, you know, it took like 2 to 3 years. So we're talking about a peak in demand and equipment shortage, but this also plays a part. We went way too fast through rotor sizes, and the infrastructure behind wasn't ready for it. You know, there is no trucking that was prepped for this jump from high 50s to low 70s. The warning didn't come soon enough, in my opinion.
Just to give you a picture of how many hours we actually spent during the last 2 years just designing a new blade coming to the market. We spent almost 100,000 engineering hours developing this system. And that doesn't come by sleeping at night. So guys, this is really important stuff. And if I can reduce 20% or even just 10%, I'll be the king at Vestas in R&D, and Anders Ved will give me a medal and an honor, and he'll be so happy. But it's really a lot of engineering hours that goes into this, and we need to design around patents, permissions, ways of transporting, bright patents that limited innovation, etc. We can do that, and we will do it in the future too. But opening up, as I said in the beginning, if we can open up and we can share it with the industry, it is not a competitive point anymore. It is simply an enabler of going into the markets. And just back to your first point where you said the PTC drop after 21. I talked to a lot of people this, and it's been a fantastic fair, and I really love it. And Elizabeth, thank you for dragging me over here. So I don't know where you are, but you dragged me over here. I learned that a lot of American good companies here, they actually the market is actually so that the turbine cost that we as an OEM provide to the market is cheaper than coal. It's cheaper than nuclear. So you can basically remove the PTC now, and we will still have a really cheap product. It's cheaper to drive a wind power plant than drive a coal plant, and even a nuclear plant. That is why it is so popular. We are selling projects in New Mexico, in Mexico City. They're buying our products in Russia, in Brazil. It's really picking up. We see a lot changing demand, and it's not just 4 turbines. It's 1 gigawatt turbines. It's big mega deals. So I really think that the market will, of course, drop a bit after the PTC, because that's the icing of the cake, but not as much as we actually thought.
And we forecast a drop in the market, but the after years, kind of after the cliff, have been growing and growing every quarter, because we're seeing more and more demand from big developers due to the technology gains that this group has made in order to reduce that cost. Honestly, the biggest competition now is not nuclear, not coal. There's no new coal plants or nuclear plants being planned anywhere, right, in the U.S. It's really coming from solar. We expect the solar market to really become extremely competitive in the U.S. And a lot of that's driven by the time of day that it's generating power. Wind blows at night, creating kind of an offset of kind of a out of phase supply versus demand. And so we're monitoring that very closely. But looking outside the U.S., you mentioned shipping turbines to Mexico and Russia and all over the world. These are all based on standardized platforms, right? All the OEMs are trying to sell essentially the same turbines around the world, and that creates the need to standardize manufacturing, standardize logistics processes like you talked about. But if we are looking at suppressed demand in the U.S., we've got a lot of logistics infrastructure and equipment here. So is there potential to use any of that equipment in other markets, to send some of the blade trailers down to Mexico or Latin America? I guess, Thomas, do you see any perspective on that?
It's a really good question, because we have a different fleet in Europe than you have in US. We actually have a factory in Brazil where we design the blades. So we have a specific system for that market. It's only used in Brazil because that's special, and we designed it for that market, simply to move the blade down there. And I think we'll be willing to do that for US too, if it makes sense. If maybe the OEMs that works in the Americas will make a generic system. We already aligned with Siemens Gamesa on the offshore side with MSI Vestas. We have made a generic tower system for the tower feed. So it's the same system. It's simply the same system, just with more holes in it, and it fits in the flanges. Pretty simple. We're trying to do that onshore too. It's a much lighter version, but we're trying to do the same with Siemens Gamesa. So that's the first step. But we start in the bottom with the towers. That's most equipment, and then we go to the blades. So, but utilizing that equipment will have a huge impact. I think we both have a lot of equipment. I don't know if it's a €1 billion or $1 billion business. Also in inventory, what we have, and we're definitely looking at that. The strategy for investors is that we want to move this into at least. We don't want to own that equipment anymore. We have over billions of euros in equipment on stock, which we simply don't want to own, basically. It's not our core. It isn't. We would love to have a say on it, but we would rather have someone lease it and have it as an operational cost. I think it's also beneficial not to put cost on these guys because, we asked our carriers to invest millions of dollars in equipment that are maybe obsolete because we have the growing design, and they will be stuck with it. So Lone Star, I guess, I don't know how many trailers you have. I heard you had a lot, right? I'm going to see you in Dallas, so I'm going to take you up on that. But I heard you had a lot of trailers standing, right? Exactly. So
Is there, I guess, David, is there a question or is there a potential to use some of these older trailers, designed for 40-meter blades, much, much smaller that aren't getting built anymore? Is there potential to retrofit those or ship them to other markets?
I think one of the things that carriers look at is the equipment investment. When it comes to the blade trailers, that's a very unique application, and it's hard to use those in other industry, as opposed to the snobble trailers where you can take the snobble attachment off your dolly and use them in different applications. So we look at that from an investment standpoint. Traditionally, as we said earlier, the wind has had peaks and valleys. So you have to adjust your investment strategy for that. We have sent equipment into Mexico to bring out blades and towers, have delivered some in Canada, have actually sent some down to Central America at one time. So there is some application for the trailers, particularly the older ones elsewhere. In the U.S., since each state is different in what it requires in its permitting process, you really need to have the latest of technology in your trailer equipment to be able to move the loads from state to state.
Yeah, Steve, you want to add on?
And Aaron, I think it would be safe to say for some within our industry, the carrier industry, we might look very kindly on some developers and OEMs that might approach us in the near future with some creative ways in which we can perhaps better share those equipment expenses. That's a tease, by the way.
And talking about international markets, it's not just projects in other markets. It's also sourcing from other markets. David, you mentioned that having a supply chain close to wind projects helps saves a lot of money because you're reducing shipments. But we're now in this phase of tariffs. There's specialized tariffs on wind energy equipment, steel tariffs. There's now a tower dispute between U.S. tower manufacturers and international manufacturers. So it puts a lot of pressure on international sourcing strategies. So Felipe, can you talk a little bit about how Siemens Gamesa has changed their strategy and reflecting the tariff and some of the developments there?
Well, the tariff is a reality, and there's a lot of potential and uncertainty with some of it. It definitely can impact sourcing. That's something that OEMs actively look into and evaluate. It's important, though, to understand the long-term and the short-term implications of the tariffs. It does make the sourcing strategy a lot more dynamic. You have to be able to adjust. We do, as a company, have a strong commitment to our domestic factories, which helps with some of the sourcing the tariff discussions. But it's a reality. We have adjusted sourcing based on tariffs for certain projects, and certain projects we have not. Again, it's all depending on the short and long-term strategy of the company.
And does that make the logistics requirements? You just have to be a lot more flexible to where components are coming into if they're being imported, or last-minute changes to domestic factories?
In this market environment that we have now, any sourcing change that would implicate in more equipment need to be evaluated before a sourcing change is made. We take the approach of not overcommit on a sourcing change before we do this evaluation. It's important. It does us no good to source from a different location and not be able to deliver product to our customer. So we're very careful on these evaluations.
Well, great. We'd love to hear some questions from the audience. There's a couple microphones set up here, so if you have any questions for the panel, we'd love to hear them.
Would you be able to talk about the outlook for offshore wind in the Americas?
Sure. So we include that in our 10-year forecast. I think it was included in one of the slides that I presented, but we expect after the PTC goes away that the offshore market will take a bigger and bigger chunk every year of the U.S. installations. There's a lot of big projects that are already underway in the Northeast. Only one operating project so far, but many more in the pipeline, and we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of megawatts that will go in off the coast of New York and Massachusetts. In the Northeast, where power prices are high, there's significant demand load and demand growth, and very difficult to build other types of power plants up there. Also complemented by a very shallow continental shelf. So we expect to see a lot of activity in the offshore segment. It presents a whole different type of logistics constraints, though, right? You're not talking about blade trailers anymore or rail cars necessarily. You're talking about getting crew transfer vessels and getting the big jackup barges deployed. Some of those have implications from the Jones Act that require a U.S. flagged vessel. Other ones are finding a way to work around that. And I'd love to hear from some of the OEMs on how they're looking at that market.
Well, I'm mostly representing the onshore, which is that product, but I'm also I'm smeared into the MHI offshore, which we have 52% stock in, so we have a say on that. So basically, it's a totally different setup. Basically, this will challenge the U.S. ports. So this is where you'll see some restraints, because you will have a lot of assembly and a lot of, I'll call it, production work in your ports. And that's a completely different setup than you have today. So maybe in Houston or any other areas where you have the offshore setup, you need to think the logistics part in that as a production setup, because you will have all the components assembled in the port. You put them together, you put them on a jackup vessel, even with the rotor and everything on. You jack them out, lift the complete turbine onto the monopile, and then you're done, basically. So it's a completely different setup than we do today. At least on the onshore, it's very different, and it's much heavier equipment. It's much heavier lifts. You require a lot more port area to assemble. A lot of people, a lot of jobs. So it generates a lot of jobs. There are some cities I can see in Denmark, and I know in Germany, Cuxhaven is a good example. I went there 10 years ago. It was like, I'm sorry to say, a small town with nothing. I remember there was a guy down there. He had a small kiosk where he sold the lottery and stuff. And then at a point, you know the story, Philip. So basically, he had, they're missing some tools, so he opened a tool shop. And this guy, he is a millionaire today, and he has a huge. He supports the offshore industry with tools today. So, it's a good story, and I think the economics behind this is also a good story. I think so.
Yeah, a lot of potential for companies in this arena. Used to shipping very big things. There's going to be a lot of activity coming down the pike in just a few years. So, getting the ports up to speed, getting the ports updated, concentrating that supply chain around the ports is going to be a lot of activity over the next few years. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick comment for everybody here. And we're discussing a lot of rail and trucking, but as a logistics community for next year, everyone plays a part. Our ocean carriers, our ports, partners. There has been an incredible amount of collaboration within the last year as a logistics community to support this peak that we haven't seen before, which is very positive. A lot of competitors are collaborating and trying to find solutions to support all of our customers, because at the end of the day, we're committed to the market, we're committed to wind power, we're committed to our customers, so we have to collaborate and do whatever we can to help each other to get through this peak season. So important to mention for everybody here that's also ocean carriers, ports, everyone in the logistics chain is involved, and it's important to work as a team.
Thank you for the panel. Very insightful. Related to what Philippe just said, and also what Thomas was saying earlier, I'm Duna from Paseng Port in Brazil, so very familiar with Vestas operations. I was triggered by the initiative that Thomas, you mentioned on standardization of how the whole logistics is set up, and how different players are getting together, and not on a competitive basis, but rather on a standardization of benefiting the whole industry. Is there any, how can we get access to it? I mean, we're a port, we have terminal operators, and I'm sure that we would love to be sitting at the table and looking at the solutions that you guys are looking into.
So the rule behind wind standardization is those it needs to be open, it needs to be broad. So everybody's welcome. So you can get my email afterwards. I'll share this. I'll try and I talked with Stephen about this, and also with the other guys. There are so many different forums, and people I've talked to. So I'm trying to go to. We're also a member of the SCNA now, so we're an active member. So I was. They took me through the threat mill yesterday, so I was overwhelmed by all the input I got. So I couldn't sleep. I didn't go to the party yesterday, so I was really sober. We went to have a steak, and then we went home to sleep. But you're welcome to this forum. So this forum is basically open, and we have the first meeting actually in Vestas. We are hosting this one in Denmark, so you're all welcome. There will be a go-home meeting, we call it, gå hjem møde in Danish, where basically we will have a pre-meeting where all the OEMs will meet up, and we will actually discuss some actual projects we're going to start up, standardization of blade equipment, both with LM, which is owned by GE. We have Siemens Gamesa on the line. We have, I think, a couple of more others coming in. And and this will then be shared. We have a shared site where this is being shared. I will gladly share this, also maybe in the Breakbulk form, then it's even out there anymore. So you're welcome. That's kind of the shared person, and standardization is on top of this forum, actually. Yeah, and the person behind it is Thomas Poulsen. I think some of you may know it. He did a PhD within offshore logistics, and he's now driving this within a company sponsored by a lot of funds. So we're meeting up every quarter and having these go-home meetings and sharing and inviting broadly. And this is also kind of, well, I could meet up with Siemens and LM, and we can do our little own thing here. Then we will get into court, and we will probably be penalized by the EU judges, and that's not allowed. So we need to do broad within suppliers, organizations, and consultants, and yeah. So I'll be happy to invite you.
Any other questions from the audience? No? Well, I think we exhausted our list of questions. And oh, here we go. Great.
What are the prospects for Mexico? I'm sorry. What are the prospects for Mexico?
In terms of market growth, we do expect to see a lot of growth in Mexico. The big problem there is a lot of the political regime change and potential for nationalization of the local utilities. Presents some complications. But there already is a pretty well-established wind portfolio in Mexico. It's been around for 15 years. I think the first project was installed. So I think it's a good outlet for the U.S. supply chain, U.S.-based supply chain. There's also a pretty good Mexico supply chain already established in places like Juarez and other blade factories. So I think all the ingredients are there. A lot of it just comes down to policy and how some of the national level politics are going to shake out on energy reform. So, but we do expect, we put out a quarterly forecast for every country in the world on wind and solar, energy storage, gas turbine development, etc. And we are expecting some growth in Mexico.
I would like to echo the importance of the forum and give you an example from another industry. I would like to continue and follow up on the forum you mentioned and give you an example of a similar industry, what this logistics focus forum gave as a result, which is oil and gas. When I was working in that big oil and gas company, we put together all the logistics manager for the different IOC exactly for that reason. Let's discuss. We have the same issue. Let's discuss together. And we achieved a lot. And we also started to do something you might think to do is sharing, especially offshore, sharing from your perspective, logistics provider, because you are all transporting the same thing, maybe sort of in the same arena. That's for you another opportunity on this forum which might arise at that point of view. But this is only if you work on the same specification, on the same way of working, on the same agency standard, etc. So this standardization might bring you to discover other elements. And so I think more people, including logistics, supply chain provider, not only asset owner, but also logistic end-to-end integrated provider, 4PL provider, might help you to add in this table and give you another type of solution. But it works. It yields a lot of saving and operational improvement.
I totally agree, and we actually are working with Maersk. We are working with BBC. We're working with Torco, actually on the vessels. Not what happens tomorrow, not in 21, but what happens in 22 and 23 and 24. So we want to look into these years, and we want to have standard interfaces. We have already built in standard twist locks in our frames. We are even willing to build in the equipment in our components. We partly did that already on ourselves. We only have legs. Everything is built in the component. You know, the standardization across the suppliers, it is the same. You know, this guy, he also moves Siemens components, and he also moves Siemens components. So we are, you know, you can probably count it in 10 fingers of the suppliers that moves the components in overall. So these companies are moving the big volumes here yeah. But I agree, it would have a benefit to sit together on the same table. Vestas has actually taken the step on the 1st of January to change the organization in engineering. So we are modularized now. So every module, meaning a blade module, a tower module, and so on and so forth, they have the complete full end-to-end value chain ownership of the design. Also in operations, also the equipment, also the service, and so on. So, and that actually enables them to have responsibility and accountability of what they design has an impact for these guys in the market. So, and my role in that is to ensure that these requirements are met towards the market. So, we are moving into modular setup, and we have organized in this structure, and it is working now. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that's the end of the time. If you would all give a round of applause for our expert panel up here.